economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. If you do not understand racism, which is white supremacy, what it is and how it works, everything else that you understand will only confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. Confuse you.
My definition of white supremacy and racism, I use those two terms as synonyms. I use the same definition for both terms. That definition is as follows: a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classify as not white.
Economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war.
Man lives in the sunlit world of what he believes to be reality. But there is, unseen by most, an underworld, a place that is just as real, but not as brightly lit. A dark side.
Well, that gets to the center of what this whole thing is about. And in the textbook for victims of white supremacy, I wrote, black people, non-white people, victims of white supremacy throughout the world are going to have to learn not to let any word in any language master him or her at any time. We should become masters of words. We don't let any word, I don't care what kind of word it is, cause us to do anything. We follow logic about what? One word, two-letter word, do. Follow, just do whatever gets the best result in every situation that we're in. That would be one of the qualifications to be a universal man and a universal woman. And when it comes to words, you don't let any word master you. You can call me anything that you want to. That has nothing to do with me. And every black person should have that mindset. It's impossible to disrespect me by calling me a name in any kind of company at any time. And I don't care what kind of word you pick. You can make up a whole new language of derogatory words and apply them to me. I mean, like 17 books in 40 different types of languages, including tribal languages and whatnot, and come and present it at a convention. Just take up 3 days calling me names. And I'll sit right there before the entire convention, and depending on whether I'm getting anything out of it, I mean getting paid or whatever, have fun. Knock yourself out. I mean, you can announce from the podium that this is what this convention is about. It's about name calling. I got a whole bunch of names that I want to call this person sitting before us, and it's going to run into the thousands. All right, run them. And that should be every black person on the planet's attitude toward name calling, period. Starting with this very minute. Call me any name that you ever want to call me. And you can throw my mother in. She's dead, okay? But even if she was sitting here alive and breathing, you can't disrespect her by calling her a name. What does that have to do with her? Nothing. It's impossible. It can't be done. Why is it can't be done? Because I said so. And every black person on the planet right now, hearing this, should act accordingly. And you'll be surprised. You talking about magic. You talking about knocking down opposition. Yeah, I ain't going to let them call me that. Oh, that hurts my feelings. See, that's the whole idea. You ain't hurt nothing about me. But now when you grab me, that's a different proposition. That's a different thing altogether. That's what I mean by that word, D-O. That's the magic word, do. I'm watching to see what you're going to do, not what you're calling me. We need to learn from that. That's what you call gaining intelligence. That's what you call gaining control. That's what you call becoming powerful. Powerful people don't worry about language. They master language. They don't let language master them. It's impossible. You can't disrespect me, and you should never even ask for respect. Oh, my goodness. You make yourself super vulnerable when you do that. You're putting everything in somebody else's hands. Say, well, I'm going to spend the rest of my life disrespecting you, fella. Have fun. That's all I'm going to say. Knock yourself out. And, of course, that's exactly what you're going to be doing. I guarantee you that. And you're going to disrespect me by calling me names? All right? Or by saying what your opinion is of me? Oh, boy. You know, I welcome that. I mean, you got anybody that's going to help you? I mean, how many people are going to join in? 10,000? 100,000? Get them. And see if you can get me to bat an eye about anything that you say. Now I'm sitting here waiting. Work out. Start. When are you going to start? You know. And person accuses me of doing something I didn't do, then I just take care of that. See, that's logic. I just simply say, well, you're not telling the truth. You're saying I did something that I didn't do. And I'm just saying that's not the truth. And I'm going to tell everybody else that that's not the truth that you told that to. All right, when they ask me. But I'm not worried about that either until somebody does what? They do something. See, we got to get into that thing about not what people are saying so much, it's what they do. Pay attention to what they do, not what they call you or what they say, how they say they feel about you. You know, the white person who would come up to Neely Fuller and say, I don't like none of you people, never have and never will. You know, you people like whom? Well, people look like you, people with color in your skin. I don't like you, I don't like your color, and I never will. Okay, all right. But I will do this. I will do this and this and this and this and this in your favor, you know, but I still don't like you, even after I do it. And so I'll look at what they're going to do, and I'll say, okay, that's a good deal, you know, no problem. It ain't personal, it's business, you know. I'm not in a love fest. See, I don't have that. I don't have that. I'm not supposed to have that. All right, love is justice, according to what I put in the book, in the textbook for victims of white supremacy. Love is synonymous with justice. So I am only seeking for you to do the correct thing. How you feel matters not at all. Even when you tell me how you feel, you've actually done me a favor, if anything at all, because that has nothing to do with nothing. Like they say in the mafia, it ain't personal, it's business.
Okay, Jay Driskell. Well, welcome to the Southern Labor Studies Association podcast. It's great to have you here talking about your book, Schooling Jim Crow, The Fight for Atlanta's Booker T. Washington High School and the Roots of Black Protest Politics. So can you set the stage for us a little bit before we launch into our discussion about the main themes of the book, and describe Atlanta at the turn of the last century, from the late 19th to the early 20th century? What was happening there?
Sure. The book takes place in Atlanta, and it covers about 30 years of Atlanta's history, from 1890 to about 1920 or so. Over that time, Atlanta basically triples in size to about 200,000 people by the time you get to 1920. Part of the reason it did that is it was the hub for about 10 major railroads. And along those railroads, thousands and thousands and thousands of people pour into the city. And what this does is, well, first of all, it creates this dynamic in which the city is growing population-wise faster than the city's infrastructure can grow. Mm-hmm. And this is generally true for almost every city at this particular time. So it creates this demand for a broad array of city services and city goods. Access to these becomes the sort of like hallmark of being, having made it in a modern city. And this includes things like, public schools, access to swimming pools, libraries, mundane things like sidewalks. Sidewalks kind of get invented in the late 19th and early 20th century and installed in cities. And only the really nice neighborhoods had them at first. These all become sort of sites of contestation between, the rich and the poor, between the, respectable working class and their unrespectable neighbors, and most importantly for Atlanta, between African Americans who have moved into the city and, of course, white Americans who live there.
Okay, so can you discuss broadly then, within this context, Southern segregation, Jim Crow, segregated norms, and how this comes to shape a particular kind of urban development in Atlanta?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So one of the key terms in my book is this idea of civic rights. And as you have the development of all of these new urban amenities, they become a new way for African Americans to assert equality with white Americans, particularly white Atlantans, I say. So we're used to understanding civil rights, the right to vote, the right to a trial by jury, these sorts of things, which are sort of long-standing, hoary, notions of civil rights history. At the beginning of the 20th century, it's really evident that there are civic rights as well. And these are access to those wonderful benefits of being in a modern city. And each time a streetcar goes by, and you have, white men and white women and black men and black women standing cheek by jowl in some of these streetcars, because they were really small at first, they're able to assert an equality of access to that particular public good. Same thing goes for sidewalks. There's a reason why a lot of the race riots in the late 19th and early 20th century start when somebody bumps somebody else on the sidewalk, because it becomes this space that's very hard to regulate by law, and segregate into the, this is the black part of the sidewalk and this is the white part of the sidewalk. Eventually it gets solved by custom and violence, but in any case, this whole sort of jockeying for position for access to these new civic rights helps lay the framework for segregation laws. And these segregation laws are touted, particularly in Atlanta, when they segregate the streetcars. Oh boy, 1902, I think it was, 1901. They do it in order to preserve public order and restore harmony between the races, because the line is really obscure in these streetcars. So it sets up this sort of, segregation laws for urban progressives in Atlanta are actually understood as progressive reforms meant to create a harmonious and peaceful city when you have two races living side by side. And for these white progressives, they were pretty sure which race should be on top, but they still wanted to make sure that there was harmony there. What happens is, as these cities are growing and expanding, you have all these urban boosters, people we would understand as progressives today. The people who fought for the municipal ownership of utilities, the people who fought to expand public schools or build public transit. And they're faced with this dilemma, because they can see the ways in which African Americans are beginning to assert this equality of access to all these new public goods, but they're very committed to expanding these public goods for, white people. So how are they going to expand and modernize the city for white people without at the same time creating a situation in which black people now have another ground to stand on to assert their equality? And this is kind of in my book, in the chapter 1, I kind of talk about this as, this is the progressive's dilemma, particularly for Southern urban progressives. And again, they solve it through segregation When that fails, they solve it through violence.
So what you're arguing then is that there are these competing notions of progress, right? Where you have white progressives with an idea of what progress is, black progressives with an idea of what progress is, and these don't always or even often overlap. And the result of this, you argue, is the emergence of a particular kind of black political activism in Atlanta. And you discuss this in your book as initially functioning under an umbrella of the politics of respectability. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about this and tell us what the roots of the politics of respectability were and what the dynamics of it were.
So a good way of understanding the politics of respectability, I mean, this has become a very big buzzword nowadays. Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote about it in The Atlantic, and everyone's talking about it, which is great. Hopefully those people buy my book. But a good way of understanding the politics of respectability is to link it back to Booker T. Washington and his Atlanta Compromise of 1895. This was a speech he gives before the International Cotton States Exposition in Atlanta. And in the speech, it was widely applauded by white Southerners. It was applauded by a certain segment of black Southerners and was condemned by a certain other segment of African Americans nationally. And in this speech, he basically said that African Americans need to give up on the fight against segregation publicly, need to give up on the fight against disfranchisement, and accept your place and work your way up from the bottom. The famous quote that everyone quotes from this, besides the cast down your bucket quote, is, in all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one is the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. What Washington is trying to say here is that all those social questions, which include things like interracial marriage, interracial sex, includes things like asserting your equality in a public space by being able to stand in the front of the streetcar wherever you want to in the streetcar. He's saying we need to remain separate as races so that we all remain fingers on that same hand. What he's terrified of, and I think a lot of African Americans are really terrified of, is that this is a moment when, the Negro question gets raised again and again. You go through the newspapers of the late 19th century, and every other editorial page has something with a new answer to the Negro question. Some of these answers are, tuberculosis is taking hold in all these cities where these African Americans are living. Maybe outside of slavery, they can't survive. Maybe they'll just die out, and that will be good for us. Sometimes it gets resolved through calling for, violence against African Americans who seem out of place. Sometimes explicitly race-based disfranchisement. Other times is deportation from the entire, continental United States. And what Washington was trying to do, and this gets back to the politics of respectability, is he's trying to find some way to define citizenship, to deracialize citizenship. In a way that allows some African Americans to stake a claim at some part of American civilization. If they start at the bottom, that's fine because they can get their way up to the top. If they get defined as outcasts, as outside of American civilization, then it's no holds barred. It's black extermination. That's what people really like. That's the nightmare imagination in the back of people's heads. And speaking as a historian, this is conjecture because I don't know what was in people's heads. Where I'm going with this is that this is where the politics of respectability come in. Booker T. Washington needs to change the question. It can't be the Negro question anymore because the answer to the Negro question is always about the Negro. He has to change it to the class question, the gender question. If you can find some way of saying, well, we'll accept exclusions. We'll accept a rigidly hierarchical society in which some people are left out and some people are included, but we make the terms of inclusion respectability, the proper sort of class deportation, deportment, the proper gender deportment. Then anyone who behaves properly can be part of that sort of new American polity that is not defined by race.
So who were the leaders among the black community in this emerging politics of respectability?
Well, a lot of these folks were, black businessmen were really, really important. Heman Edward Perry, who was the founder of the Standard Life Insurance Company of Atlanta, was one of the richest people, black or white, in Atlanta. And he developed this pretty big, business organization there and used a lot of his, money to sort of fund other sort of African-American initiatives.
And so how did that go over with the powers that be in turn of the century Atlanta, meaning the white Southern progressives?
Well, it's interesting. So Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, one of my favorite historians, introduced this idea, her 1988 book, I think it was, called Righteous Discontent. It's about Black Baptist women in the church. It's great. And she introduced this idea of a bridge discourse. And a bridge discourse is this sort of language that gets shared between, black elites and white elites. And on this bridge, they try to negotiate some sort of, way of living together. Mm-hmm. The problem is that the white elite standing on that bridge, they have no obligation to the black elite standing on that bridge. So in moments, white paternalists will feel good about themselves, by being able to help out the black community, having a few, black friends, doing something for the poor black orphans. But when that becomes costly, for whatever reason, maybe suddenly white supremacy becomes, the thing you have to adhere to get elected. Maybe it becomes too costly because the Panic of 1893 kind of takes all the money out of your cotton, and you need to compete with those people. They can just turn their backs on these folks whom have tried to build an interracial politics based on white paternalism for a very, very, very long time. And so white elites would sometimes kind of feel, obligated, but there was nothing constraining them to dealing fairly or dealing in good faith with these other folks at the other end of the bridge.
So when you talk about the strategy of, as you call it in your book, changing the subject, of moving from a discourse of race to one of respectability, you also give examples of how precarious respectability as a political strategy could be. One of the most stark examples of this is the buildup to and fallout from the 1906 Atlanta Race Riot. Would you tell us a little bit more about the race riot and especially its impacts on the politics of respectability?
The riot, when I had just mentioned about how there are these moments in which, years of, arduous interracial negotiations can be thrown out the window in a heartbeat, the gubernatorial race that leads up to the 1906 Atlanta Race Riot is one of these issues. That race pitted a progressive, Hoke Smith, against someone who is kind of an old line, more conservative Democrat named Clark Howell. And both of these had formerly been understood as, quote unquote, friends of the Negro, kind of paternalistic people whom you can rely on for donations for your church, or et cetera, et cetera. And in the midst of this campaign, the people who were backing Hoke Smith, they ginned up a fake rape scare. On the front page of the Atlanta Journal, which is the biggest offender, and the Georgian, which is the other biggest offender, there would be, in 36-point font, these enormous headlines, I guess maybe bigger font than that, that would just talk about somebody being raped somewhere by a black brute. Mm-hmm. And it happened every single day for weeks and weeks and weeks. And by the time, Hoke Smith, this works. I mean, so many people wanted to believe that, yes, African-American men who in Atlanta tended to be itinerant laborers, tended to be less pinned down, tended to be poorer, are also sort of out of control, and they're going to come after our white women. And so we must portray ourselves as the noble, chivalrous knight in shining armor and defend our virtuous maidens against these black beasts. And that worked remarkably well in ginning up a racist vote for Hoke Smith. And what happened is that all of this interracial alliance building gets chucked out the window. One of those black elites who is who's a central figure in schooling Jim Crow, is a guy named Ben Davis Sr. And he was a kind of a major player in the Georgia Republican Party. He ran the Atlanta Independent, which is like one of the more important black newspapers in the South at this time. And, he had cordial relationships with, white politicians. And this, campaign alarmed him to no end. And he understood the storm that was about to come. And he kept talking about, he kept putting these editorials in the Atlanta Independent about how black men needed to find a way of defending their black women and keeping them in the home. He wanted to make sure that black families looked respectable, meaning there was a black male wage earner and a female dependent, and the female dependent did not go out and work for wages and lived in this sort of nice Victorian middle-class household that was completely unacceptable. Completely impossible for most black Atlantans to live because black men had no work available to them, and African-American women were the ones who had the steady jobs. They tended to work as domestics for really low pay, but you could always get work as a domestic. So he couldn't even have this happen. And as tensions begin to rise, on September 22nd, 1906, he publishes this editorial that calls on a curfew to be imposed on all black women in the city, making sure they're off the streets by 9:30 p.m. And he then says, and then we have to do something about these black rapists. Now, Ben Davis is an African-American leader. He says, we have to do something about these black rapists. And he volunteers to lead an interracial lynch mob to go after these quote-unquote black brutes. He promises a, quote, red-hot campaign of death and damnation to every black brute. And this is a really interesting, desperate perversion of the politics of respectability. In most race riots of the early 20th century, it's not a fair fight. It's not an equal fight. They're basically racial pogroms in which well-armed and protected white mobs tear through black communities and they shoot at will. And what Ben Davis is trying to do here is he really feels in his bones that this is going to come. He's trying to change the question. He's trying to make this riot not about black versus white, but about respectable, law-abiding, restrained Victorian middle-class people against black brutes, which preserves some role for middle-class folks like him in the aftermath of this riot. The problem is it failed. It failed completely. On September 22nd, the very same day that Ben Davis publishes that call for an interracial lynch mob to stamp out all the brutes, Atlanta breaks out in a 3-day racial pogrom that kills about 25 African Americans. And the people that they target in this riot are not the hoodlums. They're not the criminal elements. They're not the black working class. They're not the vagrants and tramps. They're the respectable black middle class, who are the ones whose rise up the class ladder most threatens sort of like, the racial categories that put white people on top and black people at the bottom. The weirdest story to come out of the Atlanta Race Riot, and this is something that Eugenia Burns Hope, who also figures in my book, and Walter White both talk about, is that it is the hoodlums, the criminal element in a neighborhood called Darktown. They're the only ones that have a lot of guns. And are willing to use them in a disciplined way to shoot at the mob that was coming to their neighborhood. And they managed to save the people of Darktown and the neighboring black neighborhoods from, probably being killed because, here's this unrespectable black element, but who is willing to, take up arms and do very unrespectable things in order to defend themselves against this white mob. And in their sort of diaries and letters, they write about how wonderful or how thankful and grateful they should be about, the hoodlums of Darktown because they kind of saved us all. Because they kind of saved us all.
Is that it is the hoodlums, the criminal element in a neighborhood called Darktown. They're the only ones that have a lot of guns and are willing to use them in a disciplined way to shoot at the mob that was coming to their neighborhood. And they managed to save the people of Darktown and the neighboring black neighborhoods from, probably being killed because, here's this unrespectable black element, but who is willing to, take up arms and do very unrespectable things in order to defend themselves against this white mob. And in their sort of diaries and letters, they write about how wonderful or how thankful and grateful they should be about, the hoodlums of Darktown, because they kind of saved us all.
This is not a test. This is your emergency broadcast system announcing the commencement of the annual purge sanctioned by the U.S. government. Weapons of Class 4 and lower have been authorized for use during the purge. All other weapons are restricted. Government officials of ranking 10 have been granted immunity from the purge and shall not be harmed. Commencing at the siren, any and all crime, including murder, will be legal for 12 continuous hours. Police, fire, and emergency medical services will be unavailable until tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. when the purge concludes. Blessed be our new founding fathers and America, a nation reborn. May God be with you all.
The 1880s in Atlanta, and how do you spell success? David T. Howard, one of the wealthiest men in Atlanta, owns a funeral home on Piedmont Avenue. Wesley C. Redding helps establish the Atlanta Loan and Trust Company and the European Hotel, the first hotel for African Americans in Atlanta. Both are located on Auburn Avenue. 1881, Morris Brown College is founded in the basement of Big Bethel AME Church. 1883, former slave Alonzo Herndon comes to Atlanta and begins to build his entrepreneurial empire. Storm clouds always just beyond the horizon. Newsflash, Dateline, Carrollton, Mississippi, March 17, 1886. Whites massacre 17 blacks. 1887, and meanwhile, back in Atlanta, Hope Smith, a protege of the New South booster Henry Grady, purchases the Atlanta Journal to put his political agenda for white power and black repression in force. Surely, this Hope Smith has a future in Georgia politics. It's 1900, and W.B. Du Bois mounts the Negro exhibit for the Paris Exposition. The exhibit displays images of prosperous and educated African-American women and men, along with charts that depict black achievement. 1904, James Max Barber launches his magazine, The Voice of the Negro. Breaking news, 1905. We have learned that the white elite in Atlanta is worried about black progress. Unnamed sources say the white elite have launched a strategy to keep the Negro in his place. The strategy involves black disenfranchisement, racial terrorism, and the vilification of the Negro. Our sources tell us that the strategy is intended to unite all Atlanta whites, regardless of their class standing or place of residence. Wait. My producer tells me we have a tape. Let's listen.
Vicious blacks are sounding the doom of their race. The wonder is that the white men did not begin in earnest a real warfare on the blacks. We prefer peace and order, but if it must be war, the white men are ready to face it. In the name of heaven, what else can white men do except make war to the bitter end against the black devils who continue to attack defenseless white women? There is no use to deceive ourselves about the situation. A conflict, terrible in its consequences, is surely coming. The men of this community will stand it no longer. They will begin a warfare on the black race that will mean hell itself to every one of them. The blacks will be destroyed, annihilated, and completely vanquished if they do not stop these crimes.
How did we get to the 1906 Atlanta Race Riot? Here's a timeline of white attacks on black political power. 1874, Vicksburg, Mississippi. 1874, New Orleans, Louisiana. 1874, Coushatta, Louisiana. 1875, Yazoo City, Mississippi. 1875, Clinton, Mississippi. 1876, Hamburg, South Carolina. 1876, Ellington, South Carolina. 1898, Wilmington, North Carolina. 1898, Lake City, North Carolina. 1898, Greenwood County, South Carolina. 1900, New Orleans, Louisiana. 1900, New York City, New York. 1906, Brownsville, Texas. 1906, Atlanta, Georgia. We have breaking news. Hoke Smith is speaking, and yes, we have the feed. We go live to Hoke Smith.
With reference to Negro suffrage, I advocate the retention of those things which we now have to preserve white supremacy, namely the poll tax and white primaries. I also advocate the adoption of all additional legislation which can be constitutionally based to make white supremacy easy and permanent. In 37 counties in Georgia, more Negroes than white men have paid their poll tax. In all local elections, as matters now stand, the ignorant and purchasable Negro has a vote equal to that of the white man. Without further argument, it is clear that great benefits will come to the people of Georgia by the adoption of a constitutional amendment, formed after the lines of those amendments adopted in our sister southern state, which will disfranchise 90% of the Negroes of the state through an educational requirement for voting, and the right to vote will be preserved to the white men of Georgia.
That's it. You heard it. Hope Smith, Georgia's next governor, speaking to a growing throng of supporters. From September 22nd until September 25th, Atlanta, Georgia, the city too busy to hate, is in the throes of white mob attacks on black people and on black communities. Blacks on trolleys are savaged by these attackers, and these attackers do not practice gender bias, as black women are assaulted with demon-like ferocity. On September 22nd, 5 Points is ground zero, and for the next 3 days, the mob, which reached up to 10,000, moves toward the Fourth Ward, Brownsville, and other areas. Were Atlanta blacks surprised by these attacks? Surprised either by their size or their intensity? Our research indicates that the blacks in Atlanta, and indeed blacks throughout the state of Georgia, were expecting an attack. As for Atlanta's white decision makers, they too expected black Atlantans to defend themselves. Indeed, during the long weekend of September 22nd until September 25th, whites in the city were openly encouraged to stockpile weapons and to organize to wage an assault on black Atlantans. In contrast, African Americans were forbidden by law to buy guns and ammunition. But Atlanta's African American citizens did not depend on whites to provide weapons. John Eden shares a family oral history about the role his grandfather, a resident of LaGrange, Georgia, is said to have played in the 1906 Atlanta Race Riot.
You're particularly interested in a part of the other stories I would hear on Saturdays is the 1906 race riot that happened here in Atlanta. As you know, as you may know, LaGrange is about 60 miles from Atlanta. It is said that he and two of his friends, one of the ones who broke him out of jail, loaded up horse and buggy wagon, or buckboard or whatever it was back then, with shotguns and ammunition and whatnot, and traveled to Atlanta. Never heard what they did when they got here, but apparently they distributed these guns and did something. I don't know, but I never heard that story.
Negroes with guns, But what about ammunition? African-American educator E.T. Lewis, a 6-year-old resident of the city during the riot, explains in a 1979 interview how black Atlantans were able to get ammunition to defend themselves during the 1906 Atlanta Race Riot.
Negroes were put to a disadvantage due to the fact that they, although they were able to get guns, and most of them already had guns, but ammunition, they had to buy ammunition, and they had to get that from the whites. And of course, knowing that this trouble was going on, the pawn shops had been instructed not to sell any ammunition to any Negroes. Negroes soon found a solution to that because there were a few Negroes that looked like whites. They were white-skinned and blue-eyed and had straight black hair. So they would come and buy ammunition as white men.
We have these accounts from others who witnessed black self-defense during the 1906 Atlanta Race Riot.
The riot was on Saturday night. And that Sunday night, the white folks going down there where the bad niggas is. They got Purge house and shit. And they had trucks they waiting for them. They went back up house and street back on in town, on about their business. They didn't go down downtown.
But even when the riot was on, when they were having that trouble, the Negroes put up a sign, riot wanted. The Negroes put up a sign, riot wanted. The Negroes put up a sign, riot wanted. The Negroes put up a sign, riot wanted.
Black folks were not surprised by the riot. It had been building for some time. It's important to know that black folks fought back. They knew something was coming, and black women and men had guns. They went down on the second night of the riot. They rolled down in the dark town, and they had signs saying, "Riot wanted." So the white folks saw that and said, well, you know, we might want to back on up and try another part of town.
Dogtown survived the riots, but almost a year later, when black men let their guard down, the white people came into Dogtown and burned it down. But during the riots of 1906, black men defended Dogtown with their own weapons. They surrounded Dogtown, and black men were not allowed the Klan to come into Dogtown. Black men were not allowed the Klan to come into Dogtown.
And they had signs saying, "Riot wanted." And they had signs saying, "Riot wanted." And they had signs saying, "Riot wanted."
The topic starts a long time ago when I was a graduate student, and I mentioned to a professor that I wanted to look at armed self-defense in the South. And so I was motivated from that point, but it was really motivated from me being a younger student and going to the South. I was a student activist, and I met Southern activists, and they hit me with different stories than I had heard being a young man growing up in California about the civil rights movement and about the Southern movement in particular. I had no idea that black people were engaged in activity to defend themselves. And so I wanted to write this book to contribute to a new narrative on the Southern movement and understanding the Southern black folks in particular. There's a lot of stereotypes and myths, not only about the movement being an exclusively nonviolent movement, but about Southern black folks, at least in the black community. In the North and the West, it's a thought that black people in the South were more passive and they took more stuff than anybody else would take. And then we will shoot back really shows and counters that narrative, as well as most black families, even in the North and the West, and I grew up in California, there are a lot of stories about our elders having to leave the South because of getting involved in some conflict. And in my own family, after the book came out, my cousin shared with me 2 stories about 2 of my ancestors who in Louisiana got involved in conflict involving guns. And these are stories that are submerged in most black families, but we really don't have a understanding of what type of oppression our people face, but then how we responded to it. The thought is that everybody just sat back and took it. So I really wanted to kind of change that narrative, that understanding in young people's mind in particular. I wrote this book. I didn't want the book to just be a book that would be used by academics, but would resonate with common folk in my community in particular, but people who wanted to know about the South, but people who have these stories and they don't see their stories and their experience of their ancestors reflected in the dominant narrative on documentaries about the Civil Rights Movement and much of the celebrations of the Civil Rights Movement commemorations.
And we're going to start with one of the cornerstones of the movement, nonviolent resistance. You will have seen this in countless old news clips and even depicted in movies like The Butler. You'll have seen activists courageously withstanding abuse by fellow citizens and law enforcement. But what you did not see and might not have known about until now is that passive resistance in public protest did not necessarily mean an unwillingness to use force to protect themselves from violence in other circumstances. This hiding in plain sight story is recounted by the author, Professor Charles E. Cobb Jr. in his new book, This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed, How Guns Made the Civil Rights Movement Possible. And Professor Cobb is with us now. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Michelle.
What gave you the idea for this book? Or for this history, really, to kind of dig into this?
Well, as a writer, I'm very much concerned with how the history of the Southern freedom movement or civil rights movement is portrayed. And I'm very conscious of the gaps in the history. And one important gap in the history, in the portrayal of the movement, is the role of guns in the movement. I worked in the South. I lived with families in the South. There was never a family I stayed with that didn't have a gun. I know from personal experience and the experiences of others that guns kept people alive, kept communities safe, and all you have to do to understand this is simply think of black people as human beings, and they're going to respond to terrorism the way anybody else would.
Now, early in the book, you start off explaining how guns became an important part of Southern culture. The fact is that during this era of kind of intense repression, blacks were specifically forbidden from having guns previously, and those were among the things that they sought to acquire. How is that important, or why did that become important?
Well, first, I would say that right from the beginning of the country's history, going all the way back, say, to the Jamestown colony in the 17th century and the days of slavery, guns and weapons were forbidden to black people. I mean, weapons, for obvious reasons, are associated with rebellion, and one of the big fears in the South was slave rebellion. After the Civil War, guns were, you had all these black soldiers who had fought in the Union Army coming back home with weapons. So states, particularly in what's called the First Reconstruction, attempted to disarm blacks, and that was not all that successful. You see, if we were really doing a deep look at this period, say between the end of the Civil War and the start of World War I, you'd see instance after instance of blacks in the rural South fending off the Ku Klux Klan and others with weapons. It's the period what historian Vincent Harding, who just passed away, called the period of Great Black Protest.
Black men were not allowed the Klan to come into Dogtown.
And they had signs saying, riot one. And they had signs saying, riot one. And they had signs saying, riot one.
You are now listening to P.A.R. P.A.R. People Activity Radio. And I'm your host, John G. Horse. Welcome. You have found your family in a peaceful place. P.A.R. is a family-friendly information distribution program seeking to inform non-white people, in particular black classifieds, and assisting in counter-racist codification. The title of today's show is The 1906 Atlanta Race Riot, Dogtown, Respectability, Politics, and the Myth of Black American Cowardice. One more time for that title. The 1906 Atlanta Race Riot, Dogtown, Respectability, Politics, and the Myth of Black American Cowardice. This particular episode, we will be leaning heavily on Professor Akinyele Omowale Umoja, author of We Will Shoot Back, subtitled Armed Resistance in the Mississippi Freedom Movement. We also will be leaning on author Professor Charles E. Cobb, who wrote That Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed. Let's move on. Now, in this particular case, in this particular episode, we are talking about P.A.R. is attempting to talk about the 1906 racial clash. And I say racial clash because everywhere you look, in all of the publications, mainstream publications, in the curriculum, all the books that are written about this incident in 1906 in Atlanta, Georgia, it says the 1906 race riot. Here on P.A.R., here on People Activity Radio, we are sticklers. We are extremely strict about our code of using accurate terms. And in this 1906 incident, P.A.R., People Activity Radio, John G. Horse, has concluded that the accurate term to use describing this incident is the 1906 Atlanta race clash. It was an attempted ambush. It was an attempted anti-black ethnic cleansing that came up on an unexpected problem. It came up on some hard targets. See, in war, most strategists prefer to target easy wins. And if you look at the history of people who classify themselves as white and believe in racism, white supremacy in the form of war against people who they classify as black, you will find that they are master ambushers. Ambushing, the art of ambush has nothing to do with justice. Has nothing to do with toe-to-toe. Has nothing to do with honor. Has nothing to do with a word that I am very weary of using, fairness. But I digress. Ambushing has everything to do with a guaranteed win. Ambushing has everything to do with an easy kill. an unsuspecting victim, a confused victim, an unaware victim. Has nothing to do with mano y mano, toe to toe. Has nothing to do with a hard target, straight face to face. Nothing to do with that. So in 1906, Atlanta, Georgia, the elite whites had stewed up a nice, tasty, seasoned atmosphere, a nice, smelting cloud, a nice veil of anti-black fog, for the lack of a better term. And they had armed to the tooth every person classified as white and believed in white supremacy by way of war against black people. And in this mandate, in this codification of arming to the tooth, they understood that they were going to ambush. They were going to attack from what they thought was unsuspecting victims who were classified as black and are victims of the system of racism and white supremacy in Atlanta at this time. Now, you had people who were classified as black that were well off in Atlanta, and they were the target. They had spent all of their energy, and I'm talking about the talented Tith. I'm talking about all the names that we know. The first black this, the first black that. Oh, black folks was doing this. Black folks was doing that. They was doing everything but practicing counter-racist codification, and I'm talking about the talented Tith. Am I condemning the talented Tith? No, I'm not. Because under the system of racism and white supremacy, they are classified as non-white. And under that system, they are to be mistreated. Now, it's very confusing to non-white people, in particular people classified as black, in 1906 in Atlanta, Georgia, when you were a millionaire. And I'm talking about Alonzo Herndon, the founder of a barbershop that only served white people. He was able to get resources from that business, from that franchise. And I believe, I could be in error, he also founded an insurance company. This brother was well off. Now, he was a product of one white parent, one black parent, from my understanding, born into slavery. If you want to study Alonzo Herndon, he was a very outspoken black classified businessman, doing better than most whites in Atlanta. But we got to understand, and we got to look into context. His main business that he's known for only served white people. Do with that information as you will, but I will use that information to attempt to analyze his mentality. Because Alonzo Herndon, W.E.B. Du Bois, James Max Barber, Wesley C. Redding, David T. Howard, all these and others like them were the talented Tith of Atlanta. And they were always interacting with the white elites. Now, the white elites clearly didn't give a doggone about these brothers and sisters who were well off. Matter of fact, while these individuals who were classified as black and were well off in Atlanta were trying to devise compromises, were trying to construct a way that white folks would just accept justice, you had the masses of black Americans that clearly understood. Why y'all trying to cozy up with these self-proclaimed white supremacists? Let me tell you something about these times. If you were a white politician, your number one goal was to show that you were a bigger white supremacist than your opponent. In order for you to be successful in politics, you had to be financed by the wealthy, elite people who classified themselves as white. How can you get financed by wealthy people who classify themselves as white in 1906 on a white supremacist platform if the wealthy people who classify themselves as white aren't themselves self-proclaimed white supremacists? They're going to put their money into what they believe. Now, that is my conjecture. That is what I have concluded from my logic, thought, speech, and action encounter racist analysis. And you take from that what you will, but that is John G. Horse speaking from what my research on this particular subject. So you have white supremacists running on white supremacist campaign. You got white supremacist news publications spewing white supremacist rhetoric, which is all anti-black. Black brutes are raping white women. We need to fix these blacks. These blacks are running shop. We need to create laws that disenfranchise them, because the more they get enfranchised, the more they start thinking that they can just run around and slap white women around and have sex with white women and have intermarriage. We gotta protect the white woman. That means we gotta mistreat and dominate and ambush people who are classified as black. Now, there were black publications, there were black newspapers, and they would warn blacks, they would inform blacks, and that's the importance of black media, not black in media supported by whites. You need your own individual media, because had there not been black news publications informing blacks that the whites are coming and they coming to wipe us out, you wouldn't have had the incident that saved the masses of all black people. And in particular, we are talking about Dogtown. We are talking about the hoodlum element. We are talking about the unrespectable blacks, because there was black folks practicing what they call respectability politics. This talented tiff talking about we are not going to commit crimes. This talented tiff of people who are classified as black who are talking about we are not going to be drinking alcohol. They're trying to shut down all the juke joints. They're trying to shut down all the black numbers running. Well, let me tell you something. While the talented tiff was spending all their resources trying to prove to white folks that they deserve to be on the playing field with them, there was an under economy. Like I said, every time you look at these incidents, these attempted ambushes, these attempted ethnic cleansings, you always have an under economy of brothers and sisters who are living outside of the law. The law in 1906 was designed to disenfranchise and suck the resources away from black folks so they cannot survive. Either they will run away and leave, they will die off from disease, or they just will be victim of white mob violence. That was the law was designed to do. So why would you be within the law? What is your interest within the law if you are classified as black? By logic, you are a hoodlum. If you are subject to black classification, let's move on. Now, under that logic, you had black folks that were not allowed to have weapons by law. They were not allowed to buy ammunition by law. But as you heard on the testimonies of the surviving elders, black folk had family members that if you look at them, they were high yellow, white, blue eyes, dark hair. They look white. Hey, go buy me some bullets. They also had individuals for neighboring counties, neighboring cities, bringing in guns by the load because black folk wasn't getting ready for no cheek turning. They wasn't getting ready for no church service. They was getting ready to practice counter-racist violence. If it's fixing to be on, we gotta act like it's fixing to be on. And if they coming, we gon' be ready. Now, when the riot started, when the ambush started, they started ambushing soft targets, people that's trying to go to work and get to their jobs, and, you know, women on the train and little kids being knocked upside the head and strung up on the first day. And the first day, they got rained out. The white supremacists got rained out, so they all went home. And they said, okay, once the rain stops tomorrow morning, we gonna start back up. Well, least to say, all reports say that the ambush lasted for 3 to 4 days. What does that tell you? Because you're not going to see this in the mainstream publications. All you're going to see is, 12 black folks dead, 25 injured, 25 black folks dead, 12 injured. All you're going to see is black, 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 black. But if you look at the fine print, and you have a healthy suspicion of these white publications who are notorious for misinforming the public, you will notice, wait a minute, it don't take no 4 days to whip people who just sitting, taking a whooping. But it does take 4 days. The first day, you got rained out. The black classifieds, the people who were classified as black in Atlanta, Georgia. Word got back to the hood. The people with all the guns was the people on the under economies, the numbers runners, the moonshiners, the lower economy black men and women was armed to the tooth and understood what it meant to stand on your square. Not only that, there was a part of Atlanta, Georgia called Dogtown, where not only was the black folk ready, they had signs up letting the white supremacists know, if you want a riot, riot wanted here. Needless to say, the white supremacists tried to test their fortitude in Dogtown and got sent back with their tail between their legs with heavy casualties. With heavy casualties, unreported white casualties. Got so bad, they went to go get the police department. And there are reports of police being popped. There are reports of police getting at work. There are reports of police having to be carried off in a stretcher. Now we gotta call the state guard. After 4 days of black counter racist violence, Dogtown, baby. You understand me? The hoodlums, the masses of the black community who armed themselves, who wasn't sitting abiding by no anti-black legislation or laws. Counter-racist thought, speech, and action. Not only did they save Dogtown, they then went to the rescue of other black communities, and even the wealthy who would talk bad about impoverished and the criminal element of the Atlanta population of black people. wrote in their diaries, reluctantly wrote in their diaries, if it wasn't for the lower economy, if it wasn't for the hoodlum, if it wasn't for the criminal element, we'd have been wiped off the planet. What can we learn from this untold incident? Respectability politics, there's a time and a place for it. But if you conclude that, like P.A.R. has concluded, like John G. Horse has concluded, that the global system of racism and white supremacy is war, in particular, it is war against people who they classify as non-white, in particular, war against people who are classified as black. If you conclude, if you use that code, if there's a war going on, which we have concluded that it is, everybody gotta be of some use. You don't dismiss your warrior class. You create an avenue in which you can work with them, because they the ones who have no problem with taking it to whatever level they have to survive. Dogtown. With a movie. With a biopic. Who are the names? We know all the names of the talented 10th. The first black this. The first black that. We need to know the names of the riders. We need to know the story of the riders. We need to understand the masses are not a monolith. With the talented 10th, there is no group of people that's a monolith. People who are classified as black are no exception. Everybody trying to get the whooping off their back, the stigma of blackness off their back. When you are when you are skilled, family. I gotta take you here. I got to. Because we got to understand this. When you are skilled, it doesn't matter what time that you're in. It doesn't matter what time or position that your people are in. You can be at the bottom of a slave ship. If you are skilled, you will always be treated different than the masses of people who are less talented or less skilled than you. Be it you run fast, you jump high, you have a high IQ, you have a gift in music, a gift in art. If you are able to use your gift, your skill, and if the dominators find value in your skill, you will be able to be treated different, taken out of the masses of the mistreated, and you will be at a level of less terror because your skill set benefits your dominator. The first black this, the first black that, the so-called talented 10th, dubbed by W.E.B. Du Bois, however you want to say it. They always do well. Doesn't matter that your group is down, but if you don't have the understanding of you got to take the resources or you got to take your position to liberate your group, you're just going to perpetuate as a victim the very system that won't allow you to maximize your skill set. All this trying to chum up with people who are classified as white and believe in white supremacy, they have no vested interest in justice. Period. There's the track record. This isn't John G. Horse speaking. This is me just analyzing the data, the information, the track record, the history. But I digress. I'm going to end the show with the elder breaking down how the mainstream white news publications were not reporting how the warrior class, the masses, the masses, or the so-called hoodlums was giving the white supremacists that work. Here on P.A.R., we gonna take control of the narrative. We are duty bound to give our counter-racist perspective. And without further ado, I'm gonna have to cue that old clip. So, you know how we do here. Cue the clip.
They were gonna just fight, really fight for that. Yeah, that's right. And they didn't know that the Negroes out in Lakewood Heights, like the best of the white folks, been killed up more than they, really published. But I can remember that clearly, how we heard it going. So I was in there. I was up in Gelman, along with all the other people they could get there. And it was a terrible night. And the next day, the Negroes left. Now, what made them so angry was the Negroes were getting the best of them. They were killing them. They got up in trees and shot down on the I don't know whether the Ku Klux Klan or what was when they marched in there. They never did tell the truth about how many white people were killed.
A century later, we look back on those valiant African-American women and men who defended themselves and their communities. What lessons now? Science tells us that for every action there is an equal but opposite reaction. When blacks succeed, too often the reaction of white decision makers is to try to keep the Negro in his place. But here, now, a century beyond the moment, we come again to the contradiction that is America. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The right to vote is the core lesson to be learned from the events leading up to and following the 1906 Atlanta Race Riot. Wait. This just in from the Boston Globe. Dateline, July 23, 2006. The Bush administration is quietly remaking the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. They are filling the permanent ranks with lawyers who have strong conservative credentials but little experience in civil rights. Documents show that only 42% of the lawyers hired since 2003 have civil rights experience. In the 2 years before the change, 77% of those who were hired had civil rights backgrounds. And this, from the great state of Ohio. New rules that put voter registration canvassers at risk of becoming felons if they fail to follow procedures. And this, from Georgia, Saturday, September 2nd, 2006. The Atlanta Constitution reports, fighting over photo ID resumes. Georgia's effort to require voters to show photo identification at the polls is back on for now.
With reference to Negro suffrage, I advocate the retention of those things which we now have to preserve white supremacy, namely the poll tax and white primaries. I also advocate the adoption of all additional legislation which can be constitutionally based to make white supremacy easy and permanent. In 37 counties in Georgia, more Negroes than white men have paid their poll tax. In all local elections, as matters now stand, the ignorant and purchasable Negro has a vote equal to that of the white man. Without further argument, it is clear that great benefits will come to the people of Georgia by the adoption of a constitutional amendment, formed after the lines of those amendments adopted in our sister southern states, which will disfranchise 90% of the Negroes of the state through an educational requirement for voting, and the right to vote will be preserved to the white men of Georgia.
What happens when blacks succeed? the question may now be recast. What happens when average working women and men seek to exercise their constitutional rights? Stay tuned as we follow this developing story.
Indeed, a developing story. It is. Indeed, it is. And as the elder Queen Mother testified to in her testimony, she was an eyewitness. I believe she was a child during the 1906 attempted anti-black ambush. She not only said Dogtown residents or the black men and women in the under economy didn't put up no picket signs. They didn't put up no protest sign. They put up a sign inviting the fight. They put up a sign saying, "Riot wanted. Bring that ambush here." See, the ambush wasn't going to come there. And those who did try to tiptoe in there got that work. So then they started to go to neighboring wards or neighboring districts. And not only did the warrior class black men and women protect Dogtown, they sent out platoons of warrior class blacks and protected neighboring black communities. And in particular, this Queen Mother Elder said, and I quote, "They never did tell how the blacks was getting the best of the white mob and the Ku Klux Klan. The blacks was on top of buildings. The blacks was on top of trees, giving them bullet sandwiches. And I'm sure there was blacks on the ground, if there was some that did get through, giving them that work." And I quote, "They never did tell how many whites died. Look at the reports. Don't take my word for it. All it is the blacks was killed. The blacks was ambushed. The blacks got that work. They don't tell why the state guard had to be called. The police could not control the issue." Now, let me tell you something. The police wasn't trying to control the issue. The police was too busy in the ambush. When the police was getting picked off, getting bullet sandwiches, getting the work, that's when the mayor, let's get the state guard. Now, when the state guard comes, all bets are off. And now it's a panic amongst the white elite. Oh man, this ain't good for business. Let's get the same Negroes whose businesses we just vandaled, whose businesses we just destroyed. Let's get them and come to a negotiation. Call it an interracial council. Hey, look here, y'all gonna have to go over there into that little small section over there. And the main street of the business district, whites only. What happened? All that money, all that wealth, all that influence that the talented 10th had, they could have been informing the masses, financing protection, building institutions that was going to protect and preserve the masses of the black community. They was too busy putting out propaganda and sitting with white folks, practicing so-called respectability politics, talking about something we got to get the criminal element together, and we got to control the criminal element in the black community, and look what it got you. Everything that you had earned, everything that you had built, and now the white supremacists got what they want. They got you from competing against them with your insurance companies, with your barbershops, with your hotels. Everything that you had built got destroyed. And you lucky to have your life And the ironic thing about it, it wasn't these people who were trying to go to the voting polls that saved everybody who's concerned about politics. It was the warrior class who lived in the under economy, the only economy that can sustain you and that you can actually get some type of return on your talent. You following me? The hoodlums, the gangsters, the street dudes, the night people, the honky tonk, the juke joints, the liquor runners, the numbers runners. Everything negative that you wanted to spew to white folks to make them look at you different came and saved your butt. That's a lesson. That's a lesson. Everybody can be used. Everything is salvageable when you are in conditions of war. P.A.R. People Activity Radio. I hope I have contributed to less confusion. And remember, keep learning and stay codified.
Economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. If you do not understand racism, which is white supremacy, what it is and how it works, everything else that you understand will only confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. Confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. If you do not understand, confuse you. Confuse you.
My definition of white supremacy and racism, I use those two terms as synonyms. I use the same definition for both terms. That definition is as follows: a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classify as not white.
Economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war.